Right, so this is lecture week 2, part 1. This lecture is going to be broken up into 3 different parts. This lecture, we're covering the history of social welfare policy. So let me first run through a quick outline of what we intend to cover in this section. In the first part of this lecture, we'll look at 3 helping conundrums. I'll define what that is in a second here. But essentially, these are arguments put forth by a man named David Elwood, who's a professor at Harvard, a social policy professor at Harvard. Basically, he says that anytime we try to pass legislation that addresses poverty historically, we end up with some sort of difficult situation, some trade-off that we need to address. And he talks about 3 different conundrums or difficult situations, and we'll talk about what those are in a second here. And then we'll dive into the actual historical material, and we go all the way back to 1601 in Great Britain. That's where our poor laws come from, and so we'll first look at the British Poor Laws of 1601. And then we'll move to the US. We'll look at the early relief system in the US. We borrow largely from the British system, and so our very first poor laws in the US mirror those that were found in Britain. And so we'll take a look at that early relief system. And we'll take a slight detour at that point, while not necessarily the history of social welfare policy per se. We'll look at the history of the social work profession and where the social work profession came from. And then we'll get back on track. And in the next section, in the following section, we'll look at we'll move to modern social welfare policy history, and that's into the Great Depression era, the late 1920s into the 1930s, and passage of the Social Security Act of 1935, one of the most important pieces of legislation that we'll study in this class. And then in the last part of this lecture, we'll talk about the structure that came out of the Social Security Act, which is this dichotomy between social insurance and public assistance, and what those types of programs, what the characteristics are of those different types of programs. And so first, we'll talk about the helping conundrums first. The idea of a conundrum, as I was alluding to before, is that you have some situation that arises and there's some trade-off that needs to happen for us to address poverty or some other policy issue. And so I look at different dictionary definitions of what a conundrum is. I first look at American Heritage Dictionary. They say it's essentially a problem admitting to no satisfactory solution. So you have some issue that comes up, and there just doesn't seem to be an answer to it. Pretty straightforward. Another highly credible source, the Webster's Dictionary. And Webster's says something similar. It says a question or a problem having only a conjectural answer. So once again, there's an issue that comes up, and here we're speaking in terms of a policy issue or some social issue that comes up. But you can only venture a guess as to what the solution to that issue might be. And so we only have a conjectural answer. And then finally, David Elwood, who talks about these 3 helping conundrums in his book, Poor Support, he says it's essentially a damned if you do or damned if you don't situation. So you're caught between a rock and a hard place in terms of the policies that we're trying to pass. The basic idea is that any time you look throughout our history of social welfare policy and government efforts to address poverty, you'll always see some issue, some related issue that comes up where we need to address in terms of a trade-off. There's some trade-off that often needs to happen. And so we'll look at these 3 conundrums that David Elwood says emerges throughout the history of social welfare policy. So first is a security work conundrum, and the basic argument here is that when you have the government providing security to the citizens or some greater measure of security, what happens is the work effort often goes down, right? So the more equality we have, in other words, the work effort goes down. Now there's 2 different lines of reasoning here. There's sort of a psychological argument, and there's also a little more of an economic argument here. So first, in terms of the psychological argument, the basic idea is that when the government provides security to citizens, when the government is addressing poverty and making sure that no one falls through the cracks, it can reduce the pressure, the psychological pressure for people to work hard. If you know that if you might fail at something, but you know that there's someone there, namely the government, to bail you out, then it reduces the pressure to work hard. Another analogy, if let's say you're someone from a very wealthy family, and you know that if you don't necessarily get past some situation, you know that your mom or your dad is going to bail you out, they're going to pay off your loans, or they're going to help you rectify the situation, then there's less pressure to work hard. So there's a trade-off between security and work. The greater security that you have, the work incentive often goes down, or the pressure to work hard goes down. Now there's another line of reasoning here. It has to do with a little more about It's sort of an economic way to look at this, but where you have some measure of security, once again, government's providing some measure of security. Let's say, as a concrete example, that the government equalizes income. Everyone is provided the same level of income no matter what happens, then certainly the incentive to work hard goes down. Greater security results in less in the way of the work effort is the argument, or less work incentive. So if you know that no matter how hard you work, you're going to end up getting the same amount of income because the government will redistribute your income via taxation. If you know that everyone's going to get the same amount of income no matter how hard you work, what incentive is there to work hard is the basic argument. Now, we've seen this throughout our social welfare policy history, Professor Elwood argues. The next conundrum is an assistance family structure conundrum, and here is the idea that once again you have government involvement or government efforts to provide assistance to poor families. And in doing so, we may have changed the nature or the fabric of the American family is the argument. And so this is more of a conservative argument, but conservatives will point to statistics that show that the family structure has changed over the years, especially over the last 4 or 5 decades. For example, if you look at the percent of births to unmarried moms, back in 1960, the percent of births to unmarried moms was at about 5%. 5% of all births was to unmarried moms back in the 1960s, but by 2005, the percent of births to unmarried moms had increased to about 40%. Now, conservatives will argue that part of that increase was due to our welfare policies that incentivized the formation and maintenance of single-parent families, that we provided assistance to single-parent families, but not to two-parent families over the years, or we had rules like the man-in-the-house rules, which required that there not be a man in the house if you wanted to receive welfare assistance. That was back in the 1960s, 1970s. But those types of rules incentivize the structure of certain structures in terms of the family in the U.S. So that's the basic argument here. And then the last of these arguments is a targeting isolation conundrum. This is the basic idea that, once again, you have government efforts to address poverty. And so the starting point is that there's often limited resources, right? There's always talk about our debt ceilings, about our budget deficits and such. There's limited resources to go around. And so we try to channel our resources, our tax revenues, to those most in need. We try to target our resources, in other words. But the catch is, the more effectively we target those limited resources, we end up isolating those who receive the services versus those who don't receive services, and you often end up stigmatizing the poor. It's not always intentional, but we may have had sort of a good intent to help those in need, but we end up stigmatizing the poor is the basic argument. And so as we go through these materials, this historical material, keep your eyes open for these themes that Professor Elwood argues reoccur throughout our social welfare policy history.